Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Let's Talk Astrology. Today, I am delighted and honored to be joined by highly esteemed astrologer, author, and lecturer Anthony Lewis. So, thank you so much for coming back on the show. And how are you doing today?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's always enjoyable to chat with you. I'm doing fine, except that this morning I woke up with a bit of a sore throat and a cold. So I assume my voice will hold out for the interview.
Well, I hope that gets out of your system as
Yeah.
soon as possible. So, in today's episode, we're talking about the power of primary direction, specifically talking about its usefulness in chart rectification. And very quickly, let me mention that Anthony is a faculty member for our new medieval certificate here at Kepler College and will actually be teaching a primary directions course in January of 2026. Okay, so Anthony, you've put together a fascinating presentation, so let's dive in.
Okay, well, my purpose here was I was thinking I'll be teaching this course in January, and how will students decide whether they would be interested in taking it? And I thought it'd be useful to show an example of how I got first interested in primary directions and something about them. And it would also give a sense of the kind of material we'd cover in the course and the approach we'd take to trying to understand it. So this is my first primary direction. And as background, I got into astrology when I was probably 11 or 12 years old and read what I could. And in my teens, tried to put together my own chart. The problem was I didn't know exactly what time I was born, which is very frustrating for an astrologer. I knew approximately, I was born on a Monday, on Labor Day, a holiday here in the United States, in the morning. And at the time, it was when I was a teenager, I had lost my mother. She died when I was almost 8 years old, so I couldn't ask her. And what my father told me was I was born in the morning, it was a holiday, and he had agreed to help a friend paint his house that day. But I think my mother went into labor or was going into labor, and she went into the hospital Sunday night. And so my father, trying to both be at the hospital with my mother. In those days, I think the husband couldn't stay. You just stayed in a waiting room. So and the hospital was about 10, 15 minutes away from where his friend lived. So he decided to go to his friend's house Monday morning, but left word at the hospital they would call him or call his friend's house immediately if my mother looked like she was about going to deliver soon. So he told me they wanted to start early. They started shortly after sunrise. And he had been with his friend for maybe an hour or so. The phone rang. He went to the hospital. And sometime after that, I was born. So I assumed I was born somewhere between maybe 7:38 and 10:30, 11. And so I had like a 2, 3 hour time span trying to figure out what I was when I was born, but I didn't know how to do it. I was a teenager reading books from the library. So I came across this book by Llewellyn George, which was originally written in 1910. So it was an old book. I was born in 1945, so it wasn't that old then. And to my surprise, there was a section toward the end of the book, what to do if you don't know your birth time. So I used that. Here's a copy of the book, a picture of the book. This is his method. He says, if you don't know your time of birth, let's do this. Use events which occurred before the age of 30 while I was a teenager. Always the first and most pronounced event, that would be the passing of my mother. She had a heart problem and died in her sleep a few days before I turned 8 years old. Then he says, and this astounds me, when the event is the death of a parent, well, that was my event. And Saturn is near the cusp of the 10th or 4th, use Saturn as significator. Well, I had looked at charts for between 8 and 10 or 11 in the morning, and there was Saturn up in probably the 10th house. So this applies to me. If Uranus, Saturn, or Mars are in the 8th house, use those. and that wasn't true in my case. If the event is a long journey or change of residence and Uranus is near the fourth cusp, use that. So it seemed to me that this applied directly to my chart, the death of a parent with Saturn near the 10th cusp. So what does he say to do? Oh, these are the charts I played with. I mean, I've reconstructed them now. I didn't have software. I had to do everything by hand in those days. We're talking about the 1950s here. The sun rose at 6:25, and here's Saturn. It's actually in the 11th Placidus, but an hour or two later, it's going to be in the 10th, and that's the period I'm looking at. At 8:04, Libra rose, and I thought I was probably born after 8, and so with Libra rising, that would put Saturn in the 10th. And from my father's story, I thought I was probably born before 10:30, although it could have been 11, which would have made Scorpio my ascendant. But assuming that I was born somewhere between 8 and 10:30, I would have had Libra rising and Saturn near the midheaven. So he then continues, find the AE, which is the arc of the event. That is how many degrees, and he's using the equator here. On the equator, there are between the planet, Saturn, that represents the event, and the midheaven. From the year, month, and date of the month in which the event occurred, and that would be close to my 8th birthday, subtract the date of birth. Convert the answer into degrees and minutes, allowing 1 degree for each year. So this is Ptolemy's measure. 5 minutes for each month, 1 minute for each 6 days. So I knew it was almost going to be exactly 8 degrees because there were just a few days between her passing and my birthday. But calculating it by this formula, I calculated my arc was 7 degrees 59 minutes. In other words, Saturn should be 7 degrees 59 minutes away from the midheaven, measured on the equator, not on the ecliptic. Next, find the right ascension, irrespective of latitude. So he's working on the equator of the planet, which is Saturn here. Refer to the table of right ascensions. So fortunately, the book had a table of right ascensions. I could just look it up. I didn't have to do a lot of calculating because in those days, without computers, it was a bit of a pain. The right ascension of the planet, for he's getting an example, in the 7th degree of Leo would be 129 degrees 24 minutes. So he's showing you how to use the table. The right ascension or arc of a planet is its distance from the first degree of Aries measured along the equator. So on my birthday, Saturn was at 21 degrees 25 minutes. Cancer, in the table, I calculated, I had to interpolate here because I think he gave 21 and 22, was 113 degrees 6 minutes of equatorial degrees, right ascension. The arc event of my mother's death was 7 degrees 59 minutes that I calculated. Then I subtract the arc of the event from the right ascension of Saturn, and the answer was 105 degrees 7 minutes of right ascension, which gives a midheaven of 1354 Cancer. So and this was exact at 9:03:24 Eastern Wartime. So I knew I was probably born about 9:03 to 9:04 in that interval. But Saturn, he says to do this irrespective of latitude, but I guess the tables I used showed that Saturn was slightly south of the ecliptic. It would arrive at the midheaven a little bit sooner than the zodiac degree of Saturn. I have a picture that'll show that. So I rounded it to 9:04, and this is the time I used for my chart for years because I didn't have other information. And this is from Stellarium. Here's the ecliptic, here's the midheaven. Saturn in the sky is a little bit below the ecliptic. And so the degree of Saturn will go to the midheaven in this amount, but the body of Saturn will get there quicker. And I think yeah. So here I've put the body of Saturn on the midheaven and the degree of Saturn in the zodiac on the ecliptic is a little bit behind, so it takes longer to reach the midheaven. And so he said use the ecliptic without longitude rather than the body. That was his method. It's interesting that nowadays Martin Ganston, who's our current guru, prefers it the other way around. He likes the actual position of the body of the planet in the sky. He prefers to use that over its projection onto the ecliptic. So sort of the opposite approach. But I figured this all occurs somewhere between 903 and 904. So I chose 904 as a nice rounded figure. And that seemed to work well for my chart when I checked it against transits. And so this is when Saturn actually reaches the midheaven. That occurs at 9:35 and a half, or about 32 minutes after birth. So I'm born with Saturn somewhere earlier in the 10th house, and 32 minutes later, it's on the midheaven. And if you figure roughly 4 minutes crossing the midheaven is a degree a year of life, then 32 divided by 4 is age 8.
Do you feel like the added significations here is that obviously for you, the moon, the female archetype, is the mother ruling the midheaven, and that Saturn, whether it's by a quadrant house system or whole
Mm-hmm.
sign, is
Yeah.
ruling the fourth house. Does that add to your interpretation?
If you take the fourth to be the mother, yes.
Right.
Although you could take the fourth to be the both parents, which it often is in the ancient literature.
Not only with the primary motion, but it seems like you have further confirmations here by being that Cancer on the midheaven and the Saturn ruling the fourth.
Right. Cancer as the domicile of the moon also is a motherly symbol. And Saturn in Cancer is in its detriment. So it's a difficult Saturn. It's a debilitated Saturn. In terms of terminology, we talk about significators and promissors. So the significator here is the midheaven, the meridian axis in the south. And the promissor is the natal promise is contained by Saturn in Cancer, so that Saturn promises some sort of hardship, difficulty, or loss in the sign Cancer, which is a maternal sign. And the midheaven, in many traditions, is the point in the chart closely associated with the mother. And so it does make sense symbolically. Now, several authors talk about why do primary directions often not time things exactly. Often they're close, but not exact. And traditionally, Saturn is a planet that causes delays. So even though Saturn may be at 904, according to this method of rectification, because it's Saturn, its effects may be later. So it could mean I was born 905 or even a little later. And so when you try to do timing with directions, usually the faster planets are more accurate or speed things up, and the slower planets are slower, and especially if they symbolize slowness. In this case, Saturn coming to the midheaven, we have an exact time for it, but Marinus, for instance, says very clearly, you might expect that to be off by some amount, to be delayed by some amount. You might have been born later. So it's hard to get timing exact with primary directions. There is kind of a myth that primary directions, I know when I first heard of them and people speak about them, I often heard people say they time things exactly. If you can get a perfectly accurate birth time, your directions will time events exactly. That has been my experience. There are a lot of people who still claim that. And even Marinus, who gives all this explanations why they may not be exact, seems to have this underlying belief that they should be. And he gives an
With
example.
using primary directions, do you overlay this with other techniques when you're trying to get into the weeds, maybe tertiary progressions, things of this?
Oh,
Do you
yes.
add other layers?
The way they were used traditionally was as identifying time lords, basically. The initial method was what we call circumambulation, where you watched how, as the sky turns after birth, the various bounds or terms of each sign come to the ascendant or if you have another planet you're looking at, come to that planet. And in that case, then the whole period ruled by a particular term. I mean, say here in my chart, I don't have the, suppose you're born with your ascendant in the bound ruled by Jupiter in a certain sign, and that's a 5-degree bound in that sign. Then for 5 years, or for the duration of that term rising, which might be 5, 6, 3, 4 years, depending on the speed at which the sign rises, that planet, Jupiter, in our example, would be a time lord ruling your entire life for that whole period. And so the idea of primary, like Saturn in my case, the whole period in which Saturn is influencing the midheaven is a period of risk to my loss of my mother. It's not pinpointed. And then you look to, I think Marinus and Lilly use this. You look at the solar return for that year and the year before and after, but you look for the close solar returns and see if there's a matching symbol. Like, suppose, I don't remember the solar return for this year. Suppose this year Saturn is square Mars. Well, then, since Saturn is a time lord, its whole influence that particular year is to manifest the square of Mars to Saturn. And since in the birth chart, Saturn is applying to the midheaven, and in that particular year, it's on the midheaven and it's getting hit by a square from Mars, that would be a year in which you'd expect some difficulty related to the 10th house and probably the maternal symbolism and Saturn symbolism. The other thing in terms of derived charts, as you pointed out, Saturn rules the fourth, which is a sort of generic, the parents, the early home life. It also rules the fifth, which is the eighth from the 10th. So this is the, the house of death of the mother. If the 10th is the mother, the fifth is her passing. And so when Saturn gets activated, so does the fifth house signification.
So you're looking here for multiple confirmations, and I can't help but think about perfections because at 8 years old, would you not be in an eighth house perfected year?
Exactly. I
And
would be
then
in an eighth house perfection.
that ruler is also a female archetype for the Venus as well.
Right. And the Venus is in the 10th.
Hmm.
Yeah, so what Marinus did, he would look at the primary direction as if it were a time lord for a period. Then he'd look at the solar return for that period, the lunar returns for that period, and the transits for that period, and use each successive method to try to pinpoint what and when it might happen. But the what he based largely on the primary direction, because that covers a whole period of time and gives you symbolically what could happen during that period. And then if the solar return confirmed it in some way symbolically, you'd expect that's what would happen. And then you'd use other methods to hone down to like a transit level where they identify a day or week in which something might happen. Lilly did something very similar, but he also used perfections, which Marinus did. Marinus thought perfections were superstition and non-scientific, and we got to get rid of them. Lilly found perfections useful especially in timing, when a primary direction might manifest. And he wrote a whole book about it. His book 3 of Christian astrology is all about his method of using primary directions, not only in forecasting along with other techniques, but in rectifying a chart. I like this. What this is, the program Nova Chartwheels has this chart in it figure. And what this is, imagine that this is the Earth in the middle, and this little dot is the North Pole. So you're out in space looking down at the Earth, and particularly you're above the North Pole looking down. And so this green circle then is the equator, which is concentric around the North Pole. This outer circle is kind of the equator projected outward with all the degrees of right ascension of the equator. And then this is your local horizon based on where you are on Earth. And the black circle is the ecliptic. And the green ecliptic in relation to the black equator, that's the obliquity of the ecliptic, 23 and a half degrees or so. And these are the planets projected out from the center of the Earth showing their equatorial measures. Their ecliptic measures are the little dots here on the black circle. So here is Saturn. Here is the meridian, the midheaven due south. And the measure, we could actually count it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that would be age 8.
Wow, remarkable. What a great
So,
visual this is as well.
yeah. And basically, this is what we're doing with primary directions, where we always use the equator to measure time because, our time zones on Earth are measured along the equator. And each Ptolemy says, let each degree on the equator be a year of life. It turns out that's an approximation. It's actually a little more than a year of life. If Nibod came along and probably others and said, no, the Ptolemy is close, but not exact. So if we use the average daily motion of the sun along the equator, we get a much better estimation of the timing of an event. But this is a primary direction. It's the arc between it's a planet that promises something in your life and a significator that shows where it's going to happen and what area of life. So Saturn is the promissor, promises some sort of hardship. The MC is a significator, among other things, involving the mother. And when will the hardship involving the mother take place? At about age 8. That's a number of degrees between them. That's it. That's all you
Remarkable.
have to.
Simple and spot on. It's
Yeah,
quite incredible the power
yeah,
that this tool.
right. Um, it is I think it's a remarkable tool. Um, and it's really quite simple. Now, when I first tried to learn this, the books I would read, they were like spherical trigonometry books with all kinds of formulas, and I had no idea what they were talking about. Conceptually, it's just this. But if you try to learn it from those more mathematically oriented books, it gets very confusing because they're basically showing you how to calculate things using spherical trigonometry. And that would be a whole course in itself. So I'm calling my course an introduction, and I'm not emphasizing the mathematics of it, more the conceptual. I mean, if you got it, what it is, then the mathematics you can let the computer do the math. This is when I studied astrocartography, this is years later, I realized that we could do this on the surface of the Earth on an astrocartography map. So let me go back. So this is my local meridian. It goes through, I was born in Connecticut, heart of Waterbury. So here is the local meridian for Waterbury. Here's the ascendant line. So I'm born right at this spot. And if I look on the Earth, Saturn is to my east. England is over here somewhere. And here's the east coast of the United States. And so this distance between my local meridian where I was born and the location of Saturn when I was born is the primary direction. It's the arc. And so as the Earth turns from west to east and the sky appears to turn from east to west, in primary, you imagine the sky is carrying the planet westward. And so the sky, things rise in the east, culminate and set in the west. Saturn is moving toward my local meridian. It'll get there in about 32 minutes when I'm 8 years old. And the Saturn line will then be exactly right here on my local meridian line, and that's when the direction will be most active. So I think this is
It's a great another great visual
yeah,
representation by bringing in the astro mapping parts of it.
right. And basically, it's this map, but shown geographically on the surface of the Earth. And so this is the 32 minutes later, and here's the Saturn line right on my local meridian line. Okay, at 9:36. Okay. Now, primary directions originated first to try to determine when somebody was going to die, how long they were going to live. And the idea was move this, that if you're an astrologer, especially you're an astrologer in the first century BC, you don't have a computer, you don't even have a calculator. It's a lot of work to interpret a chart. So why should you spend hours and hours calculating when will I marry, when will I have children, when will I advance in my career, if the person's going to die in 10 years? So they began by saying, let's figure out from the chart how long they're going to live. And if they're going to die in childhood, let's stop there. If it shows they're going to have a full life, then we will start doing all these other techniques to determine other important events in their life. So they began with length of life. And then if they found that the length of life was reasonable, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 years, then they would look, use the system, circumambulations, and later more mathematically accurate primary directions to forecast events throughout the life of the native. But they always began with life. How long will this person live? And once I'm assured astrologically that they will live, then I'll tell them when they're going to marry, how many children they're going to have, what they're going to do for a living, etc. So the method of circumambulations is the earliest form of directing, I think. And basically, you took the sign, most commonly the ascending sign, but if you identified, the Arabs came up with this idea of Hyleg, has different names. Uh, this is the point or planet in the chart that's associated with giving life to the native. And then you would see over time what contacted the Heilig as the sky moved in circular motion, primary motion, clockwise. And you would direct it through the signs and particularly pay attention to their terms or bounds. And so here's an example. Is this my chart? I think so. And I don't know what I'm distributing here. I think I'm distributing the moon. Yeah. In my chart, the moon is the Heilig. It's in the 10th house. It's aspecting the ascendant. It's conjunct Venus, so it's in a good position. So if I distribute my Heilig, which is the life-giving component of the chart, and it begins, it's in early Leo, so it begins in the Jupiter bound of Leo. Here's when I'm born. And then a year later, it moves into the Venus bound of Leo. And then in 1951, when I'm 6 years old, I think, it moves into Saturn, Saturn's bound. And it stays there for 7 years till 1959. In 1953 is my mother's death. So it occurs, Saturn, it's called the distributor or divisor, depending on what book you read. Uh, I think the Latin uses divisor because the bounds divide up the signs into segments. Um, so Saturn is active from 51 to 59, roughly 8 year period. And so during that period, there's then in 1953, Saturn right on the midheaven. And I don't think I put the solar return or transits in here, but you can see how using the circumambulation, identifying Saturn as the Time Lord during this period, and then Saturn is quite active in a primary direction in a particular year, and then the the solar return would show Saturn active also, and particular transits around, she died in late August, would also show Saturn being activated by transits. You would then get a sense of timing.
So again, here you're talking about the importance of multiple confirmations, not only from the primary directions. We've got the distributor here, Saturn in that period when you turned
Yes.
8 years old. Then
Hmm.
you're also talking about the solar, lunar returns, the transits, everything
Right.
layered upon to give you multiple confirmations
Right. And perfections. I mean,
and
at age
perfections.
8, I'm in an eighth.
Eighth
I'm
house
actually, I was
perfected
actually technically 7 years old when she died.
here.
And
Okay.
so that is the eighth house.
Ah,
Right. So it's an eighth or eighth sign from the ascendant. So,
mm.
so by perfection, I'm in a house of sign of death from the ascendant period.
To me, it just again, it just speaks to the power of astrology and it never ceases to blow my mind. Not only how little I know, but you put all of these factors
Whoops.
together and just how accurate it can be is
Right.
quite remarkable.
Okay. I think I already talked about this. This is distributing the moon, and we're in the Saturn bound. I think I put this up just to show. Here's Leo. I'm born with the moon in the Jupiter bound, and then it spends 4 years in the Venus bound, and or 4 degrees, not years. And then in this bound is when the Saturn reaches the midheaven, and I have the perfection of the eighth sign from the ascendant. Okay. So this is a summary in graphic form of what we were just talking about. So here's my moon. Circumambulation, we imagine the moon is walking around the chart. In reality, the chart is rotating around the fixed position of the moon, but this is the primary direction. And in circumambulation, we imagine the moon, which is the Hyleg here, is going this way. Um, okay, and I think this we already talked about, but this gives you another view of what we're talking about. So when I'm 8 years old, Saturn is, this bound is right here. And as you can see, if this bound, if the sky rotates so that it's over the moon, then Saturn moves about the same amount and it's over the midheaven. Okay.
Do you also pay attention to the outer planets as you're
Yes, yeah.
looking at these?
Yeah, the tradition uses only the seven, the two luminaries and the five visible planets. Yeah, but of course the outer planets are significant. I begin by looking at just the seven standard,
Sure.
right? And especially the methods we have inherited are all based on the traditional planets. And then I incorporate the outer planets on, the Uranus, Neptune, Pluto on top of that.
Sure. I just thought that Pluto is quite prominent there in your chart as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I would certainly look at that. Yeah. But I find it's best to start simple and then build on top of it. Because once you get a comprehension of what's going on in it for the fundamental nature, then the other factors supply further details or confirm. The more you confirm something more, the more confident you are in forecasting.
Mhm.
Um, so we talked about it. So the So let me talk about the outcome. The outcome was I used 904 as a birth time for several years. And then sometime in my, so this is my teens, then in my 20s, I was helping my parents clear out their attic. And there was an old trunk and had a lot of junk in it. And I found a little notebook, those little tiny ones about the size of a phone. And thumbing through it, I noticed that my father would keep notes about the family. And he had a note about my birth in there. And it just said Anthony, 905, 7.5 ounces. So there was my time of birth and how much I weighed. And when I saw the 905, I was blown away because it was 1 minute off from the method. And maybe it wasn't off at all because Saturn was involved. Maybe it was 905. Um, so I began
That
to use,
actually again, that just blows my mind, just
yeah, it
how
blew my mind.
accurate
Yeah,
that from a minute from eventually finding your father's note that put down the time as 9:05 and just being a minute on by using all these techniques. I mean, that just blows me away.
it blew me away. And so, I mean, it convinced me there's something to this technique.
Right.
And then what happened was I didn't have my official birth record. Well, I sort of didn't. When in the United States, it used to be when I was a teenager, when you turned 16, you had to get a social security number. And to do that, you had to show proof of birth. So my parents had gotten me a birth certificate, but it was this little one. I didn't realize there were two forms. So there was an abbreviated form and then a bigger form. And I looked on my birth certificate, there was no time. It had an official stamp. It showed where and when I was born, but the date and the place. And so I thought they just didn't record the time. And so now this is years later after I found my father's notebook. I decided to check and I contacted the Bureau of Records and they said, oh no, we have a bigger form. And if you send us $10, we'll send it to you. So I did. And so on my official birth certificate, it says 909. So now I have three birth times. I have 904 by rectification, which worked very well. 905, which I started using only a minute offset, also worked very well. And then the 909 also seems to work very well. So I really am puzzled because I've had three different astrologers look at my chart, um, asking what they thought about the birth time. One of them is a friend and colleague, and he said, oh, he thinks the 909 is the best one. And he's an experienced person who does a lot of rectification. Another person who came recommended, but I didn't know her work. She thought the 904 was the better one. And then I have a friend who's a good Vedic astrologer, and he thought the 904 was the better one. So, um,
So what are your thoughts on which you believe is the more accurate time? Have you overlaid events further on your life beyond obviously like
well,
whether it's your own marriages or children or things of that nature?
what happens is, depending on the time I test, and they're all within a 5 minute range, so they're all going to be fairly close. But if I get a precise hit, say at 904, then it'll be a little bit off, but a different event will be exactly on target. And see, a difficulty with rectification is you never find I don't think it's possible to find a time that gives you an exact hit for every major event in your life. So you get a good average time that's exact for some events and close for many others. And you try to find the ones that sort of statistically works the best in most cases. So that's one thing that happens. The other is depending on the technique you use. For example, the original timing key was Ptolemy's, 1 degree on the equator is 1 year of life. My experience with that, and in the literature, almost all astrologers who've used it find that it times things too early. Uh, but there are astrologers who swear by it and say, no, it's perfect. It times things exactly. Well, if your timing method, or your timing key is different, then you're going to time events differently. Um, and in the literature, most astrologers came to claim that the Nibod key was the closest to being accurate. But even that is just the average daily motion of the sun. It's not the precise motion of the sun. And so there are some astrologers who say you should use the actual, the true motion of the sun on the day of birth, or you should use the true motion of the sun for each year of life, which what Ptolemy did. He just, no, I mean, Placidus did. The problem is if you try those methods, sometimes you get exact hits and sometimes you don't. And I haven't found, I tend to use NIBOD a lot because it tends to be closer for timing accuracy. But then I began noticing that a lot of times Ptolemy would be too early, NIBOD would be too late. And if I used the midpoint of the two, it was much closer to being accurate. So I think different methods have different timing devices, and they're close, but no one has a perfect timing device. Um,
Absolutely fascinating. Well, Anthony, thank you so much for going through. And I really enjoy personal experiences when people are sharing
mhm.
chart examples. And thank you so much for sharing a very personal and sensitive event in your life to apply these techniques and to give us an enriched understanding of how powerful these tools are in astrology to work in our lives.
But I did it, as I said, because I'll be teaching this course, and I wanted to give students a chance to see what we would be covering and how we would be covering it. And if this is of interest, maybe they should take the course. And if not, then they shouldn't take the course.
Absolutely. Well, I want to stop the screen share and we'll talk
Sure.
briefly about that now.
Okay.
Um, I think I can do it for you. There we go.
Mhm.
So speaking specifically about the course, this is going to be in January of 2026. Now,
Mhm.
is this going to be, I can't quite remember, is this a 5 week course or a
But
10?
it's 5 weeks. Yeah.
5 weeks. So and I can't remember if you've fully fleshed out the course already, but would you like to say any more about what might happen from week to week, or are you still working that out?
I think it's generally worked out. As I said, primary directions have been around for more than 2,000 years. So the challenge was how to condense 2,000 years into 5 weeks. And each generation of astrologers has inherited the past and then modified it and passed it on to the future. So what I decided to do, and as I said earlier, spending a lot of time on the calculation, I think is not going to be that useful. And so to me, what's most important is understanding conceptually what is a direction and what is it used for. And so that's the focus. So, and to understand it, you really have to understand some basic astronomy. So I'm going to begin with basic astronomy. And I mean, basic, nothing too fancy. Although, if you don't have a background or aren't sort of scientifically minded, it may be a little hard to understand because imagining the sky moving and the earth rotating and it's like the stuff we talked about today, or planets having latitude or no latitude being just projected onto the ecliptic and they're being different. So I will spend a fair amount of time covering those basic concepts. And I thought it'd be important to go over at least one example every class because you can hear the theory, but until you see it in a chart, it doesn't make so much sense. So I picked some interesting historical examples, um, as well as some contemporary, like people I know, that sort of thing. And then their usefulness is, I think, in prediction and in rectification. So I'll begin with what is a primary direction? How do we understand it conceptually? What's happening in the heavens and in the chart when we say one planet's directed to another? How are they used in prediction? And then toward the end, the last maybe two classes show how they're used in rectification, which is one of their main uses today. And also quote important references to show how different major astrologers over the years have conceptualized. Like, what did Ptolemy think? What did Marinus think? What did Lilly think? What did Placidus think? Oh, and there are different methods for, especially for intermediate planets between the angles between the horizon and meridian. How do we measure when those two planets will align? And there's different methods to do that. And I think it's important to understand the concept behind what they're doing rather than the mathematics. I mean, the math is obviously important, but if you know what they're trying to do conceptually, then the math makes a lot more sense. And to do all this in 5 weeks is that there's a lot of material in the course. I have never taught this course before, so we'll see how it goes. But certainly we will cover the basics, and my hope is people will understand it fairly well. And then it's not a complete course, and it's not comprehensive because that would take probably a whole semester just on primary directions. But my goal is to explain enough so that students will understand it clearly and then they can, on their own, use it with charts or continue to read the literature. There's a vast literature on it and understand what these traditional authors are talking about. Because there's a lot of vocabulary that goes with primary directions that may be a little odd or unusual or
And
unfamiliar.
talking about the literature, what books do you recommend people read to dive in to learn more?
Well, I think Martin Ganston, his first book, just called Primary Directions, is excellent. And that's going to be the textbook for the course. So my hope is to get through enough of that book so that students understand clearly what Martin's talking about and they can continue to read that book. Martin has a newer book on, what's it called? Annual Predictive Techniques. Uh, I wouldn't start there because he's talking more about annual forecasting using a lot of the medieval techniques. And it's a very good book, but I think it's at a level beyond his first book. And then for those who are Dehori, Lilly's book 3 is quite good. Um, he gives fairly clear explanations, has lots of examples. Uh, the problem I've had with him trying to recreate his math, I get different results, and I don't know why. I don't know if he didn't his aren't accurate, if I'm doing something wrong. So it's hard to recreate his examples on my own. Often he'll have a direction perfecting in a different year than I get, and I haven't figured out the reason. It may be that I think he wrote book 3 during the plague when he was at his country home trying to avoid getting infected and may have been overwhelmed at the time and just not mentally up to doing a lot of math, but I don't know. Um, the book that I've read and reread Most is Marinus. I think it's book 22. That is dense. It took me, I think, several years of reading it several times to start to begin to comprehend what he was talking about. It's really good, but I wouldn't start there. But it's good as a reference. And a number of the charts I'll discuss in the course come from that book. Uh, and then there's a newer book, what's it? Alexi Borealis has published a book on predictive astrology, and I think the entire section on prediction, horarium prediction, is devoted to the Regiomontanus system used by Marinus to forecast. And that's a good book. That uh, I tend to prefer the Placidian method rather than Regiomontanus, mainly for historical reasons. And but Alexi's book is very good. And he also, oh, software is an issue. He had to create his own software because none exists that does what he wants to do. Um, Software for primary directions, there isn't, I haven't found a really good one that does everything I want to do. The closest may be Delphic Oracle. That's what it's called. Um, which was written by Curtis Manwaring, who was connected with Project Hindsight. Um, the issue is with software, different authors use different techniques, and the modern authors who tried to understand what primary directions were, about modern meaning 19th, 20th century, often misunderstood what the classical authors were saying. And so they programmed their misunderstandings. Um, Two examples. And Ganston goes over this. Primary directions are based on the idea that after birth, the sky keeps rotating clockwise around the chart. Everything keeps rotating from east to west. So that significators are always to the west of chromosaurs. Chromosaurs, planets that promise something, significators are the area of life where it's going to happen. Now, sometimes, like in my chart, Saturn is in the 10th and is moving toward the midheaven. But if Saturn happened to be in the 9th, it would be moving away from the midheaven. So what the traditionalists did is they say, well, in that case, let's imagine that the degree of the zodiac on the midheaven continues to move towards Saturn. And we'll call that a converse direction. The movement of the heavens is the same, but what's converse is you're sort of switching the roles. You're switching roles, but not positions of the midheaven and Saturn. Saturn's now west of the midheaven. And when you calculate that, you use a different method. You use one method if it's approaching the midheaven, but if you have just the degree of the midheaven moving toward planet, then you're going to use, if you're Placidian, proportional semi-arc. If you're Regiomontanan, you're going to use a circle of position, just technical. These are what I mean by technical terms. And you're going to get a different result. So what the 19th century astrologers, who were basically theosophists, they took the theosophy and applied it to the ancient literature and said, well, let's just move the sky backward. I mean, in reality, the sky moves clockwise. Let's move it counterclockwise and measure that. And they called that a converse direction. But Ganston points out, well, it's not a traditional converse direction. A converse direction is just a shift of roles. The sky never moves backwards because that means you're going into the past. Now, the interesting thing is these modern converse directions, which I think Ganson then relabels neo-converse directions, work, and they work quite well. So now we have two different forms of converse directions. And and it turns out what the Theosophists did, it works. If you use those directions, you get meaningful dates of events. And so that's one example. Uh, I sort of lost my train of thought here. Example, how modern astrologers, the other, and this is a big one, the Alan Leo crowd, I think, misunderstood Placidus. Placidus was an amazingly brilliant astrologer, and he came up, you know, he invented the term primary direction because before him everything was called a direction. And he wanted to distinguish primary directions from what we call secondary directions, a day for a year. And he realized that his contemporary astrologers, his method of doing proportional semi-arc is mathematically not easy. So he tried to invent an easier method that was a close approximation to his modern semi-arc, his proportional semi-arc method. And he came up with what's now called Placidus under the pole, which was basically the same idea of Regiomontanus, of using what are called circles of positions for planets. But instead of doing it the Regiomontanus way, he did it his way. So the Placidus circles of position were much closer in their result when you calculated them to the actual Placidus proportional semi-arc. I'm just looking at your face and you look puzzled. And so the British astrologers of Alan Leo and his group misunderstood Placidus, and they thought he was recommending this as the best method. In fact, he was saying, you guys have so much trouble with the math of the correct method that Ptolemy proposed. I invented a method like the one you're used to that Placidus popularized, but that's much closer to what Ptolemy did and what I do. But this group misunderstood and thought this is what the best form of calculating is. And so if you read these early books, not even, late 1900s, early 2000s, even into the later mid 2000s, they're teaching the Placidus under the pole method, which, I mean, you can use it, and it's usually within several months of what Placidus and Ptolemy would have done, what they believe is the correct method. So there's things like that where it gets complicated. I don't know if you understood any of that.
No, that's again, Anthony, you're such a wealth of knowledge, and that's why I always look back, love going back over the recordings. And again, it's just a privilege to have you here to pull all these pieces together. And it must be a great deal of work, as you mentioned, to condense 2,000 years into 5 weeks, which is
Right.
remarkable.
So it's
Absolutely.
possible we'll run out of time for certain things, but my goal is to, if I cover the basics and people get it, then they can, it won't be hard to understand the rest.
Perfect. Well, again, Anthony, thank you so much. Forgive me, everybody, if you can hear background noise. I think I've got the neighbor mowing. I don't know if you can hear that. But to reiterate, in the next couple of months, you'll see a link to sign up for Anthony's primary directions class. So certainly check that out. And then we're going to put a link to the wider information for the medieval certificate, and you can check that out there as well. So Anthony, it's always an honor and a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for your time. And again, thank you for sharing such a sensitive and very illuminating example from your own life to show the power of these techniques and these tools.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be here. It just occurred to me, once you post this, I'll put the link in the course. This will become part of the course.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. And thank you all for watching, and we'll see you all again next time. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Cheers.